A Battlefield Rescue, Love at 9 Feet Tall, written by Quirks of the Galaxy. The battlefield was a graveyard of shattered metal and scorched earth. Smoke curled upward in lazy spirals, the remnants of a brutal conflict that had left no victors, only destruction. The air was thick with the stench of charred machinery and the copper tang of blood mingling into an oppressive haze that clung to everything it touched. Velyara moved through the wreckage with a grace that belied her towering frame. Her forearms worked in tandem, brushing aside debris or lifting broken shards of metal with ease. Her violet eyes scanned the landscape, sharp and calculating, while her long emerald hair, tied loosely at her back, swayed with her movements. She wasn't here by choice. The sounds of battle had driven her from her hidden outpost days earlier. Now, curiosity, or perhaps a sense of guilt, drove her to comb through the remnants. Bodies lay scattered, some barely recognizable as either human or alien. She muttered a low prayer under her breath, her voice a soft rumble as she passed them. She had seen enough death in her life to know that no one deserved to die in the dirt like this. Pausing at the twisted remains of a human dropship, she crouched low. Her sharp hearing had caught something, a faint, erratic rhythm, a heartbeat. Her brow furrowed as she carefully pushed aside a crumpled piece of hull. Beneath it lay a figure, motionless save for the shallow rise and fall of his chest. A human. Velyara's eyes widened slightly as she took him in. He was clad in a battered exosuit, its once pristine surface marred with scorch marks and dried blood. His helmet was missing, revealing a face smeared with dirt and blood, but unmistakably alive. His hair was dark, plastered to his forehead, and a jagged cut above his temple oozed sluggishly. She reached out with one hand, her fingers larger than his entire forearm, and gently pressed them to his neck. The pulse was weak but steady. "Still breathing," she murmured in her language, her voice low and melodic. The human stirred slightly at her touch, his head lolling to the side. His lips parted, but no sound came out. His face twisted into a grimace before he slipped back into unconsciousness. Velyara exhaled deeply, her shoulders sagging slightly. She knew what she had to do, though it was no small task. Sliding her upper arms beneath his torso and her lower arms under his legs, she lifted him effortlessly, cradling him against her chest. His weight was negligible to her, but his fragile state was evident in the way his limbs hung limply. The journey back to her outpost would be difficult. The terrain was rough, and she would need to avoid any lingering patrols or scavengers. But as she glanced down at his face, so small and vulnerable compared to her own, she felt a strange pull. She couldn't explain it, but something about him stirred a sense of urgency within her. This wasn't just an act of mercy. It felt important. Adjusting her grip, she began to move, her long strides carrying them swiftly away from the ruins of the battlefield. For the first time in years, Velyara felt as though she was walking toward something rather than running away. The cave was nestled into the jagged cliffs that rose above the battlefield, hidden from view by thick, winding vines and a narrow entrance barely wide enough for Velyara to squeeze through. It had served as her refuge for years, a place of solitude far from the conflicts that plagued the galaxy. Inside, the space opened into a wide cavern, its walls lined with bioluminescent moss that cast a soft greenish glow. Crates of salvaged supplies were stacked neatly along one wall, and a small fire crackled in a stone pit at the center, its warmth chasing away the chill of the night air. Velyara ducked through the entrance, careful not to jostle the unconscious human cradled in her arms. She laid him gently on a cot she'd fashioned from woven vines and padded with furs. His body looked so small against the massive frame, barely occupying half of its width. She crouched beside him, her violet eyes scanning his injuries with practiced precision. The gash on his temple was the most pressing concern. Blood had caked around the wound, and she could see faint bruises forming along his jaw and cheek. "Poor thing," she murmured, reaching for a bowl of water she'd drawn from a nearby underground spring. Dipping a cloth into the cool liquid, she began to clean the wound. Her movements were gentle, her large hands surprisingly nimble as they worked. The human stirred slightly, his face twitching at her touch, but he didn't wake. Velyara worked in silence, her mind racing as she tried to make sense of her decision. She had never interacted with a human before, though she'd heard stories of their tenacity and their fragility. Why had she felt so compelled to save this one? Her eyes drifted to his face, and she found herself lingering there. His features were sharp, his skin pale beneath the grime. There was a quiet strength to him, even in unconsciousness. She shook her head, breaking her gaze. "Foolish thoughts," she muttered, wringing out the cloth. When she was satisfied that his wounds were clean, she set about removing the battered exosuit. The armor plates were dented and scorched, and the seals were barely holding together. With a few deft movements, she unclasped the suit and peeled it away, revealing a wiry frame covered in bruises and shallow cuts. "You've been through a lot," she said softly, her tone almost apologetic. She fetched a salve from her supplies, a mixture of herbs and minerals she'd learned to make during her time in isolation. With careful hands, she applied it to his wounds, watching as the greenish paste absorbed into his skin, soothing the inflammation. As she worked, the firelight caught the faint scar running down her own arm, a reminder of her own past battles, her own survival. When she finally finished tending to him, Velyara sat back on her heels, her forearms resting on her knees. She watched his chest rise and fall, steady now, though his breathing was shallow. "You'll be all right," she murmured, as if trying to convince herself, as much as him. The silence of the cave pressed in around her, broken only by the crackling fire and the distant drip of water. For the first time in years, Velyara felt the weight of someone else's presence in her sanctuary. It was strange, unsettling even, but it wasn't unwelcome. She stood, her towering form casting long shadows on the cavern walls, and moved to check her perimeter. There was no telling who or what might have seen her leaving the battlefield with her newfound charge. Ethan's eyes fluttered open, his vision blurry and his head pounding. For a moment he could only make out muted colors and the soft glow of an unfamiliar greenish light. A damp, earthy scent filled his nose, mixed with the faint aroma of herbs. He blinked several times, trying to orient himself. The last thing he remembered was the battlefield, a chaotic swirl of shouting, explosions, and pain. Now he was lying on something soft, his body cocooned in warmth. "Where?" he croaked, his throat dry and scratchy. A shadow moved in the corner of his vision, and Ethan froze. As the figure approached, his senses sharpened, and he found himself staring up at the largest being he had ever seen. She was towering, easily twice his height, with deep blue skin that shimmered faintly in the firelight. Her forearms moved with a graceful precision that seemed almost hypnotic, and her violet eyes regarded him with a mixture of curiosity and concern. "You're awake," she said softly, her voice a rich, melodic tone that reverberated through the cavern. Ethan's heart hammered in his chest. His survival instincts kicked in, and he tried to sit up, but his body protested with a sharp, stabbing pain. He groaned, slumping back against the cot. "Easy," she said, stepping closer. "Your wounds are still healing." Ethan's gaze flickered to her hands, or rather one of her hands, which held a bowl of water. The other three arms were either resting at her sides or occupied with other tasks he couldn't quite discern. "Who? What?" he stammered, his mind racing to make sense of the situation. "I'm Velyara," she said simply, kneeling beside him. Even crouched, she loomed over him, her presence both comforting and intimidating. "I found you on the battlefield. You were in bad shape." Ethan's head swam as he processed her words. He looked down at himself, noting the bandages wrapped around his torso and the faint scent of some kind of medicinal salve. "You saved me?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Velyara nodded, her expression unreadable. "Yes, you're safe now." Ethan swallowed hard, his throat dry. "Why?" Her lips parted as if to answer, but she hesitated, her gaze flickering away for a moment. "I couldn't leave you there," she said finally, her tone quieter. Ethan wasn't sure what to say. He was grateful, of course, but the sheer size of her, the alienness of her features, it was overwhelming. Velyara stood, and Ethan instinctively tried to follow her movement, pushing himself upright. His muscles screamed in protest, but he managed to sit up, swinging his legs over the side of the cot. And that's when he realized just how tall she was. Ethan tilted his head back as he rose to his feet, his gaze traveling upward, past her waist, her torso, and stopping abruptly at her chest. He froze, his mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water. His face burned with embarrassment as he realized his eye line was directly level with her ample, well-defined attributes. He stammered, stepping back quickly. His heel caught on the edge of the cot and he nearly fell, catching himself just in time. Velyara tilted her head, one of her lower hands reaching out to steady him. "Careful," she said, her tone calm but tinged with amusement. "I'm fine," Ethan blurted, his voice an octave higher than usual. He straightened himself, still refusing to meet her gaze. "Just didn't realize you were, that tall." A small smile tugged at the corners of Velyara's mouth, her violet eyes glinting with quiet humor. "You're not the first human to notice," she said lightly. Ethan risked a glance up at her face, noting the way her expression softened. Despite his embarrassment, he found himself relaxing, if only slightly. "Well, thanks for saving me," he said, rubbing the back of his neck. "And, sorry for that." Her smile widened just a fraction. "No need to apologize, you're still recovering. Sit before you hurt yourself again." Ethan nodded quickly, lowering himself back onto the cot. His face was still red, but he couldn't help but chuckle under his breath. "What's funny?" Velyara asked, arching an elegant brow. "Nothing," he said, shaking his head. "Just, this is probably the weirdest day of my life." Velyara's smile softened further, and for a moment the air between them felt lighter. "Then I hope it's a memorable one," she said, her tone teasing but kind. The fire crackled softly in the center of the cave, casting long, flickering shadows on the rocky walls. Ethan leaned back against the cot, nursing a steaming bowl of some alien concoction Velyara had prepared. It smelled earthy, but the taste was surprisingly pleasant, a mix of savory and sweet that reminded him of some Earth cuisines, though he couldn't quite place it. "So," Ethan began hesitantly, breaking the comfortable silence, "you've got me patched up, fed, and saved from dying on the battlefield. What's next? You plan to keep me here forever?" Velyara, seated cross-legged nearby, glanced at him, her violet eyes narrowing slightly. "Do humans always assume they're prisoners when someone helps them?" Ethan blinked, caught off guard. "No, I just meant, I didn't mean it like that." He rubbed the back of his neck. "It's just, not every day you wake up in a cave with a giant alien." Velyara's lips twitched, her version of a smirk. "Not every day I have a small human stumbling around my space." Ethan chuckled nervously. Then his gaze drifted toward the glowing vials and jars arranged meticulously on a nearby shelf. "Are you a healer or something?" Velyara's expression softened, her upper hands folding gracefully in her lap while her lower ones worked a small piece of cloth into a bandage. "In a way. My people value knowledge, especially about the body and how to mend it. I studied for many years." Ethan nodded slowly, sipping his stew. "That's pretty amazing, honestly. On Earth we have doctors. Same idea, I guess." "Doctors?" Velyara echoed, the unfamiliar word rolling awkwardly off her tongue. She tilted her head. "You humans have such strange words." "Doctor?" It sounds like something you'd yell at a broken machine. Ethan nearly choked on his stew, laughing. "It does, doesn't it? I never thought about that." He set the bowl down, grinning. "Okay, your turn. What's the word for healer in your language?" Velyara paused, her gaze thoughtful. "It doesn't translate well. The closest word would mean keeper of balance. Keeper of balance, Ethan repeated, rolling the phrase around in his mouth. That's poetic. She shrugged with all four shoulders, a gesture Ethan wasn't sure was dismissive or amused. Perhaps, but it's accurate. Healing isn't just about fixing the body. It's about restoring harmony, ensuring everything is aligned. Ethan nodded, impressed. Makes sense. We're not so different after all. Velyara's head tilted again, her eyes glinting with mischief. Except for the height difference. Ethan groaned, covering his face with one hand. You're not going to let that go, are you? Her soft laughter filled the cave, a sound that was surprisingly musical. Not any time soon. They fell into a companionable silence for a moment before Ethan cleared his throat. So, I noticed you keep looking at me sometimes. Is that normal, or am I doing something weird by alien standards? Velyara's brow furrowed slightly. Looking at you? Yeah, Ethan said, gesturing vaguely, like when I'm eating or just sitting here. I keep catching you staring. Her expression shifted, her cheeks darkening slightly. A blush, perhaps? It's not staring, she said firmly, though her tone wavered. It's observing. Observing what? Ethan asked, his curiosity piqued. You're smaller than most beings I've encountered, she admitted, glancing away. Fragile, but resilient. It's fascinating. Fragile, Ethan repeated, feigning offense. I'm not fragile. I survived a battlefield, didn't I? Velyara's gaze returned to him, her lips quirking upward. Barely. Fair point, Ethan muttered, deflating slightly. He leaned back, staring up at the jagged ceiling of the cave. So what do you think of us humans, then? Velyara hesitated, her eyes scanning his face as if searching for something. You're different, she said carefully. You're driven by something I don't fully understand. It's relentless. Ethan raised an eyebrow. Relentless? That's an interesting choice of words. It's not an insult, Velyara added quickly. It's just unusual. My people approach challenges with patience and caution. We weigh every option, consider every possibility. But you humans, your kind rush headfirst into chaos, often without a plan. Yet somehow you endure, Ethan smirked. We like to call that improvising. Improvising, Velyara repeated, testing the word. She shook her head. It sounds reckless. It is, Ethan admitted with a grin. But it works, most of the time. Their conversation continued, meandering through topics ranging from human cuisine to Velyara's people's traditions. Ethan found himself enjoying her company more than he expected, her sharp wit and calm demeanor balancing his more impulsive tendencies. But for every moment of camaraderie, there were also moments of unintentional misunderstanding. Wait, Ethan said, holding up a hand. You're telling me your people never celebrate birthdays? Why would we? Velyara asked, genuinely perplexed. A birth is merely the beginning of existence. It's the life that follows that matters. Yeah, but it's fun, Ethan insisted. Cake, candles, gifts, you're missing out. Velyara raised an eyebrow. Cake? Ethan grinned, realizing he might have just stumbled onto another cultural bridge to cross. Oh, we're definitely talking about cake later. You're gonna love it. The days passed, each one blurring into the next, as Ethan and Velyara settled into an unspoken rhythm. The more time they spent together, the more Ethan realized how much he had come to rely on her quiet strength. Velyara, despite her towering height and alien origins, had a grounded presence that made him feel strangely at ease. They spent hours talking about everything and nothing. Ethan shared stories of Earth, his childhood, and the absurdities of life in the military. Velyara, in return, recounted tales of her people, their serene yet fiercely protective nature, and the places she had seen in her travels. Yet even as their conversations flowed easily, there were still moments where the gap between them seemed too wide to bridge. Velyara, with her careful, logical manner, would sometimes look at him as if trying to decode something she couldn't quite understand. And Ethan, well, there were times when he couldn't help but notice how different she was from the women he had known, so strong, so graceful, and yet so distant. One evening, as they sat by the fire, Ethan absent-mindedly picked at the small pile of rocks beside him. His mind was wandering, and he found himself staring at Velyara's long, elegant limbs as she worked on something, her fingers moving with careful precision. "Do you ever feel alone?" Ethan asked suddenly, breaking the silence between them. Velyara looked up, her violet eyes steady. "What do you mean?" Ethan scratched the back of his neck, unsure of how to word it. "I mean, you seem content, I guess. But I can't help but wonder if being alone out here by yourself is isolating?" Velyara paused, her expression unreadable. For a moment she simply stared into the flickering flames, lost in thought. "I have always been alone," she said finally, her voice low and steady. "It's the way of my people. We are solitary by nature and we learn to live with it. But there are times, yes, when it feels empty." Ethan watched her, sensing the weight behind her words. "Empty how?" She met his gaze, her usual calmness giving way to something more vulnerable. "There are no bonds, no shared moments, no connection beyond duty and responsibility." She exhaled slowly, her shoulders lowering slightly. "But then, I met you." Ethan's heart skipped. He wasn't sure if it was the firelight playing tricks on him, but her words seemed to hang in the air between them like a tangible thread, pulling him closer. He shifted, feeling a bit awkward but not wanting to let the moment slip away. I feel that too sometimes. This whole situation, being stuck here, being stuck with you, it's strange, but it's not bad." Velyara looked at him, and for the first time Ethan saw something other than her usual guarded composure. It was soft, almost warm, like a hint of something deeper beneath the surface. "You're not what I expected," she said quietly. "What? A soldier who's a little too loud and a little too clumsy?" She smiled, a small, rare smile that made his heart flutter. "Not at all," she replied. "But I didn't expect kindness, or patience, or humor. You're unlike anyone I've met." Ethan chuckled, rubbing his neck awkwardly. "Well, I'm not much, but I do try." They sat in silence for a while, the crackling fire the only sound between them. Ethan could feel the tension between them shifting, though neither of them spoke about it. Something was changing, something unspoken, and he couldn't help but wonder if maybe, just maybe, there could be something more than this strange companionship. But as the night drew on, and the stars twinkled brightly outside the cave, Ethan had a feeling that whatever this was, this connection between them, wouldn't be simple. Just as their connection deepened, fate had other plans. Their peace was shattered when a sudden rumble from the ground shook the cave, throwing Ethan off balance. Velyara's reflexes were lightning fast as she grabbed him, pulling him upright just in time. "What the hell was that?" Ethan asked, his voice edged with concern. Velyara's brow furrowed. "The ground trembles. Something is approaching." Ethan stood up, steadying himself. "Approaching? What does that mean?" Before Velyara could answer, a loud mechanical roar echoed from the distance. Ethan's heart raced as he looked toward the cave's entrance, where the sound grew louder. Velyara's eyes narrowed. "We need to go." "No argument there," Ethan muttered, scrambling to grab his rifle. "You think we've got company?" The ground shook again, more violently this time, as Velyara nodded. "The planet's been invaded, and I don't think they're friendly." The two of them raced toward the exit, Velyara's long legs easily keeping up with Ethan's hurried pace. As they burst outside, they could see the towering silhouettes of ships descending on the horizon. Massive warships dark against the blood-red sky. Ethan's breath hitched. "We're not just talking a simple raid, are we?" "No," Velyara said, her voice deadly serious. "This is war." The storm had come, and the quiet life they had found in each other's company was about to be tested in ways they never imagined. As the first wave of invaders landed on the planet, Velyara grabbed Ethan's hand, squeezing it tightly. "We fight together," she said, her eyes blazing with determination. Ethan met her gaze, his resolve hardening. "Together," he echoed. The bond between them had grown, and now they would face the ultimate test, not just of survival, but of love and trust. Together they would fight to protect each other, and whatever future they could build. The sky above them was darkening, filled with the ominous shadows of descending ships. Velyara moved swiftly, her movements graceful yet deadly as she readied herself for what was coming. Ethan stood by her side, his heart pounding in his chest, trying to focus on the immediate task at hand. "We need to fortify the entrance to the cave," Velyara said, her voice steady and commanding. "It's our best chance for shelter." Ethan nodded, adjusting the strap on his rifle. The weapons he had grown accustomed to on Earth felt strangely inadequate against the scale of what was coming. Still, he gripped it with the resolve he'd learned in the military. Survival was all about adapting. As they worked together to move rocks and debris to block the entrance, there was a moment of quiet between them. Ethan caught a glimpse of Velyara's profile, her eyes scanning the horizon. Despite the danger, despite the chaos that was about to unfold, she exuded a calm confidence that made him feel both at ease and terrified. "Velyara," he said, breaking the silence, "are you sure we can hold them off? I mean, this is a whole invasion force." Her gaze shifted toward him. "We're not alone in this, Ethan. You're here, I'm here, and together we can hold them long enough to make a stand." He wasn't sure if she was trying to reassure him or herself, but he appreciated it nonetheless. The ground shook again as the ships landed, their massive engines roaring to life. Ethan's breath caught in his throat, but Velyara remained calm, her hands steady as she set the traps around their shelter. "They'll come for us first," she said, almost as a reminder to herself. "But if we're lucky, we'll get the element of surprise." "You sound confident," Ethan muttered, half in awe. "What's the plan?" Velyara turned to him, her violet eyes glowing in the dim light, filled with a mixture of determination and something softer. "We fight back, and we do it together." Ethan's heart skipped a beat. There was something in the way she said "together" that made him feel like he wasn't just some soldier on the battlefield. He was a partner. Her partner. The first wave of enemies charged toward them, and the ground erupted into chaos. Explosions rained down around them, shaking the very earth. Ethan barely managed to dive for cover behind the rocky outcropping as the first of the invaders advanced. Through the haze of smoke and dust, Velyara moved with fluid grace, her blaster out, her every movement a picture of deadly precision. The first few enemies fell to her sharp aim, but more kept coming. Ethan fired off a few rounds himself, his nerves pushing him forward even as his hands shook with adrenaline. In the heat of the battle, there was a moment where time seemed to slow. Ethan was cornered by two enemies, their weapons trained on him. He braced for impact, knowing he didn't have much time to react. But before he could pull the trigger, Velyara was there, towering above him, her blaster raised. In one fluid motion, she took them both down, their bodies crumpling to the ground in a heap. "You okay?" she asked, her voice low, concern flashing across her face for just a moment. Ethan swallowed hard, trying to ignore the shaking of his hands. "Yeah, I think I am, thanks to you." Velyara gave him a small, reassuring nod before turning her attention back to the enemy forces. "This is only the beginning. Stay close." The battle raged on, and despite the odds, they continued to fight side by side. Their chemistry, their trust, only deepened in the midst of the chaos. Ethan began to realize that it wasn't just the physical battles that were bringing them closer, but the emotional ones as well. They were fighting for each other, for a future together. And the thought of that, of not being alone, kept him grounded amidst the violence. As the battle drew on, Ethan noticed a shift. Velyara's movements, which had once seemed more detached, now had a sense of urgency behind them. Her eyes constantly flicked toward him, checking to make sure he was still standing, still fighting. And every time he saw her glance at him, he felt a warmth in his chest, a connection he couldn't ignore. Just when it seemed like the battle was too much to bear, with enemy forces swarming their position, the tide shifted. A sudden wave of Zarnith reinforcements arrived, their ships cutting through the air with sharp precision. Velyara's shoulders sagged with relief, but Ethan saw something else in her eyes, a sadness, a quiet realization. "It's not over yet," she said, her voice thick with emotion, "but it's a victory." She turned to him, her expression serious. "We fought together, Ethan. That's what matters." Ethan took a step forward, his heart racing. This was it, the moment that would change everything. Without thinking, he reached out, taking her hand in his. "We make a good team." She didn't hesitate, squeezing his hand back with a firm grip. "Yes, we do." The battle was won, but the war was far from over. Still, in the aftermath, as they stood together on the battlefield covered in dirt and blood, they both knew something had changed. The bond between them had been forged in the fire of conflict, and no matter what happened next, they would face it together. They might have started as strangers on opposite sides of an impossible war, but in that moment, they were more than that. They were partners. And nothing, not even the vast differences between them, could break what they had built together. As the enemy forces retreated and the chaos of battle finally began to subside, the sky overhead darkened with the approach of Zarnith ships. They cut through the atmosphere with a brutal efficiency, their sleek forms easily identifiable by the distinct angular design and glowing violet accents. Velyara's gaze softened as she saw the ships approach. "There they are," she murmured, her voice a mix of relief and something else, an unspoken weight. Ethan watched her closely, noticing the subtle shift in her demeanor. She was no longer the warrior, the confident alien who had been by his side through the thick of battle. Now she seemed almost distant, her attention focused on the incoming fleet. "They've come to reinforce us," she explained, though her tone was quieter than usual. "I should have known they'd be watching my back. The Zarnith don't leave their own behind." Ethan wasn't sure how to respond to that. He didn't know much about the Zarnith, but it was clear that Velyara had a complicated relationship with her people. They were her race, her heritage, and yet there was something about the way she stood apart from them that made Ethan wonder what kind of history lay between them. One of the Zarnith reinforcements, an imposing figure who stood well over 7 feet tall, stepped forward from the fleet. His armor was a polished silver, adorned with markings that seemed to signify rank. His eyes, glowing faintly purple, flicked toward Velyara. "Velyara," he rumbled, his voice deep and heavy with authority. "You did well." Velyara nodded, offering a brief, respectful bow. "It's not over yet, Jorath, but the enemy is retreating." Jorath's eyes flicked to Ethan, his gaze lingering for a moment longer than necessary. The silence between them was thick, filled with unspoken questions. Finally he spoke again, his voice colder now. "And the human?" Ethan stiffened but didn't back down. He had been through too much with Velyara to be intimidated by anyone, especially not someone from her own race. "He's with me," Velyara said firmly, her tone leaving no room for argument. "He's not your concern." Jorath's gaze narrowed slightly, but he gave a respectful nod. "As you say, Velyara." There was a long pause, and Ethan could almost feel the tension crackling in the air. Jorath didn't move to speak further, his attention turning to the retreating enemy forces. Velyara stepped forward, her hand briefly brushing Ethan's as she did. "Don't worry," she whispered. "This is just protocol. He's not my superior." Ethan nodded, though he still felt a strange unease. The exchange had been subtle, but there was something about it, something about the way Jorath had looked at him, that made him uneasy, but he pushed it aside, knowing that their immediate concern was the safety of the camp and the aftermath of the battle. The Zarnith reinforcements began to land, and the battlefield started to calm. The Zarnith medics began to attend to the wounded, and the damage from the skirmish was assessed. As they worked, Velyara and Ethan remained close, still side by side, though there was a quiet moment of reflection between them. Ethan's eyes met Velyara's, and for a moment the weight of everything they had been through together hung in the air. But there was something new now, something undeniable. As the Zarnith reinforcements moved around them, Velyara finally spoke, her voice softer than before. "Thank you, Ethan. I couldn't have done it without you." He met her gaze and smiled. "You didn't have to. You've got the Zarnith to back you up." "But I guess I was glad to be here." Velyara nodded, but her eyes lingered on his for a moment longer. "You're not just here, Ethan. You're with me all the way." Ethan's heart skipped a beat at her words. There was a vulnerability in her eyes now, a crack in her usual composed exterior. And for the first time he saw her as not just a warrior, but someone who had been through more than she'd ever let on, someone who was finally letting him in. The reinforcements quickly secured the area, and though the battle was over, the work wasn't. They moved through the area, collecting fallen soldiers and checking the wreckage. In the midst of all of it, Ethan and Velyara found a quiet spot near the edge of the battlefield. It wasn't much, but it gave them the space they needed to breathe. Velyara leaned back against a rock, staring up at the stars. Her eyes seemed distant, and Ethan wondered if she was thinking about the Zarnith back on their homeworld, or if she was simply processing everything that had happened. "You know, you're not just a soldier, Velyara," he said, his voice soft. "You've got I don't know, a soul that's hard to find in this galaxy." Velyara turned her gaze back to him, a faint smile tugging at the corners of her lips. "You're a strange human, Ethan, but I think I'm starting to see what you mean." He smiled, letting the silence fall between them for a moment. It wasn't much, but it was something. A connection that had been forged through the chaos of battle, and now strengthened by the quiet moments that followed. And as the night sky stretched above them, filled with stars, Ethan knew that despite all the differences between them, height, race, and the tumultuous path they had ahead, they had one thing in common: survival. And that perhaps was enough to see them through whatever came next. The night after the battle passed quietly. Ethan and Velyara found themselves retreating into a small, cave-like structure nestled on the edge of the outpost. The dim light of the stars filtered through the entrance, casting shadows across the cool, rocky walls. It was far from the ideal place to rest, but it was all they had for now. Ethan's muscles ached from the battle, and the warmth of the fire they'd started was a welcome relief. He sat near it, his body tense but relaxed in Velyara's company. She was across from him, her dark violet eyes staring into the flames, lost in thought. "You know," Ethan said after a long silence, "I never thought I'd end up here, on an alien planet in the middle of a war, but here I am." Velyara's eyes flickered briefly to him before she spoke. "I'm sure it's not exactly what you expected." He chuckled. "No, definitely not. I always thought I'd be fighting on Earth, you know? Maybe for a cause I believed in, but this is different." "It's all different when you're caught in the middle of it," she replied, her voice low and thoughtful. "But you've done well so far, Ethan. I didn't expect a human to be so adaptable." Her words surprised him, and he raised an eyebrow. "Adaptable? You don't think we're just a bunch of weak, unpredictable creatures?" Velyara glanced up at him with a small, knowing smile. "I used to think that. The Zarnith have always seen humans as unpredictable. It's why we look down on you. Your species doesn't follow the same rules. Your strength is in your chaos, in your unpredictability." Ethan leaned back, mulling over her words. "And you think that's a weakness?" Velyara's smile faded slightly. "It was easy to think of it as a weakness, but after seeing you in action, I see it differently." He laughed softly, shaking his head. "I'm not so sure. I just do what I have to do to survive." She tilted her head, her gaze softening. "Isn't that what we all do? You've been through more than most would be able to handle, and yet here you are, still standing. Maybe we all have more in common than we think." There was a long pause as Ethan considered her words. The weight of her gaze, the softness in her voice. It felt different from when they had first met. There was an intimacy in it now, something deeper. "So, what about you?" he asked. "How do you handle all this? Chaos, the war, the way your people see me. How do you deal with it?" Velyara was quiet for a long moment, her gaze drifting back to the fire. When she finally spoke, her voice was softer than usual, almost vulnerable. "I've been taught to be strong, to never show weakness. The Zarnith value strength, and for a long time, I thought that meant physical power, being able to fight, to defend, to conquer." Ethan frowned, leaning forward slightly. "But you don't seem like the type to care about that kind of thing." Velyara's eyes met his, and there was a flicker of something in her gaze, a flicker of the conflict she was feeling. "I didn't, but I learned to hide it. I learned to bury what I really wanted, to become what they expected me to be. It's why I left my own people, why I don't want to go back." Ethan's brow furrowed in confusion. "Wait, what? You left your people?" Her lips twisted into a small, bitter smile. "I wasn't strong enough for the Zarnith. I wasn't like them. They saw me as weak because I didn't fit their mold. I didn't want to follow their rigid rules, their cold ideas of strength. I couldn't be what they wanted, so I left." Ethan was stunned. He hadn't expected this. He'd always known there was something more to Velyara than the fierce warrior who had saved him on the battlefield. "You don't have to go back to them, Velyara," he said, his voice steady and sincere. "You don't have to be what anyone else wants you to be. You're more than that." Her eyes searched his face, and for the first time there was a raw honesty in her gaze. "I didn't think anyone would understand. I didn't think I could ever let go of the past." Ethan reached out, taking her hand in his. It was a simple gesture, but it felt like a promise. "You don't have to do it alone. I'm here." For the first time since they'd met, Velyara allowed herself to smile, just a little. It wasn't the fierce, battle-hardened smile he had seen before. It was something softer, more human. "Thank you, Ethan," she whispered. Their bond was stronger than ever now, but the war was far from over. As the reinforcements continued to move in and new challenges arose, Velyara and Ethan had to find a way to navigate the tension between their people and their growing relationship. They could no longer ignore the threat of war. Yet, in the midst of it all, their connection had deepened, their understanding of each other strengthening. Despite the odds, despite the disapproval of her own people, they would face whatever came next together. The war had reached a tipping point. The reinforcements had arrived, but they weren't the only ones to make a move. Their enemies, still smarting from their losses, were regrouping and closing in on their position. Velyara and Ethan knew they had no choice but to take action. But this time, they would have to fight side by side. The tension between them was palpable. They'd been through so much together already, but now there was something more at stake. Their bond, still fragile in some ways, would be tested in a way neither had anticipated. As they prepared for the battle, the feeling of being a team, of relying on each other in ways they hadn't before, washed over them. They took their positions, their fingers trembling not from fear, but from the weight of what was to come. Velyara was larger, more powerful, but Ethan was faster, more precise. Together they made a formidable force. At the start of the battle, Velyara moved with the precision of a seasoned warrior, but then, in a split second, an enemy force closed in on her. She was cornered. Ethan, without thinking, rushed to her aid, diving into the fray without hesitation. "Velyara!" he shouted, making his way toward her. She looked over her shoulder, eyes wide with surprise as he charged into danger. "Ethan, what?" But before she could finish, a blast of energy shot past her, narrowly missing her. Ethan dodged, the sharp edge of a blade grazing his side. For a brief, heart-stopping moment, Velyara froze. In the heat of battle, she could feel the emotional weight of the situation. Ethan was risking his life for her, for someone he barely knew, someone who wasn't even his species. She wasn't used to anyone caring that much. "Don't ever do that again!" she barked, her voice sharp. She moved to intercept the attack, but the panic she felt was real. Was it possible she cared that much about him too? Ethan grinned, even as blood dripped from the side of his face. "It's a little late for that," he replied, dodging another strike as they continued to fight together. In that moment, something shifted. The battle was still raging around them, but in that brief exchange, the trust between them solidified. They had each other's backs, without question, without hesitation. It was no longer just a bond born from necessity. It was something deeper, something more. Once the battle ended, both of them stood, catching their breath amidst the chaos. The ground was littered with the debris of battle, destroyed ships, broken weapons, and the lifeless bodies of enemies they'd defeated. Velyara's breathing was steady, but her eyes were fixed on Ethan. His wounds weren't fatal, but they were enough to remind her how fragile this moment had been. "Are you all right?" Velyara asked softly, her voice low but filled with concern. She didn't even recognize the tone at first, soft and caring. Ethan, grinning despite the pain, nodded. "I'm fine. Nothing I can't handle." Velyara stepped closer to him, her eyes scanning his wounds. There was a tenderness in her touch as she adjusted the fabric of his shirt to better examine the cut on his side. He could feel her breath close to his skin, the heat of her presence making his heart race in a way he hadn't expected. "Let's get you back," she said, her tone shifting from worry to determination. She carefully guided him away from the wreckage, her hand on his back as they walked. Neither of them spoke for a few moments, the quiet following the chaos. But in the stillness, something was clear between them. Their relationship had deepened, and their connection was undeniable. Back at their safe house, still a cave, but now it felt more like a home, the exhaustion from the battle settled in. Velyara helped Ethan to sit, her eyes scanning the room as she prepared to treat his wounds. The intimacy between them was now undeniable. She was so careful as she cleaned his injuries. For the first time, Ethan allowed himself to relax in her presence, letting go of the tension that had been building for so long. Velyara, seeing his trust in her, felt a shift of her own. The boundaries between them that had once seemed insurmountable, height, race, culture, began to blur. She wasn't just caring for him as a soldier, she was caring for him as someone she now recognized as an equal. And that recognition, her need to care for him, to protect him, was something that hadn't been there before. There was no confusion now. "Thank you," he said quietly as she finished applying the bandages. She looked up at him, her gaze soft. "You saved me first. It's only fair." And for the first time, Ethan saw a flicker of something deeper in her eyes. It wasn't just gratitude, it was a connection. A bond that had been growing stronger without either of them realizing it. After the battle, they spent more time together. They shared quiet moments, their conversation now easier, more natural. They laughed over small things, but also shared deeper moments of vulnerability. One night, as they lay next to each other, the warmth of their bodies pressed together in the cool cave air, the truth settled between them. "I've never felt this before," Velyara said quietly, her voice almost a whisper. "Felt what?" Ethan asked, his voice hoarse from exhaustion. "This connection," she said. "This bond." Ethan didn't need to say anything. He simply shifted closer to her, pressing his forehead against hers. And in that moment, everything was clear between them. There was no question anymore. They were more than comrades. They were partners, equals. And neither of them could imagine a future without the other. As the days passed, the feeling between them deepened. What had begun as a quiet, growing respect had shifted into something far more powerful. They spent their nights side by side, sharing not just warmth, but vulnerability. Their connection was undeniable. Velyara would often catch herself watching him as he went about his tasks, her heart swelling with a mix of awe and something softer, something she wasn't sure she could even name. Ethan, in turn, found himself drawn to her in ways that went far beyond physical attraction. He had never imagined that someone so different from him, someone so much taller, stronger, and more alien, would be the one to hold his heart so completely. They began talking about the future, not just about survival, but about a life together. The bond they had formed was growing stronger, and with it came the realization that they couldn't imagine a future apart. One evening, as they shared a quiet meal, Velyara broke the silence. "Ethan, have you ever thought about what comes next?" Ethan looked up from his food, the question hanging in the air. He swallowed before answering, his voice quieter than usual. "I used to think that everything would be about the next battle, the next fight. But now I don't know. I've been thinking about what happens after the war is over." Velyara's gaze softened. She placed a hand on his, her fingers warm against his skin. "I don't want just survival. I want to live, Ethan, and I want to do it with you." His heart skipped a beat at her words. He had never expected to hear such a confession, and yet here she was, bearing her soul in a way that only strengthened the connection they had forged. "I want that too," Ethan said, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "I don't know where this goes, but I know that I want it to be with you. Forever." Velyara nodded, her eyes glistening in the low light. She had never imagined this kind of love was possible, especially not with someone so different. But there was no question in her mind. Ethan was her future. "Ethan, would you bond with me?" she asked, her voice soft and vulnerable. It was a question of deep significance, one that carried with it not just the promise of love, but the commitment to a future, to a life together. Ethan looked at her, his heart racing. He had never heard such a request, but in that moment it felt like the most natural thing in the world. I would be honored," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I've never been more sure of anything in my life." The next few days were a whirlwind of preparation, but it wasn't for an elaborate wedding ceremony. Instead, it was a quiet, intimate bond they would share. A union of souls, not defined by tradition, but by the depth of their feelings for each other. Velyara had explained to him the Zarnith tradition, a deep, sacred bond between mates. It wasn't about a formal ceremony with rituals or grand speeches. It was a private, personal promise. It was something that transcended species, transcended everything. It was about the soul finding its counterpart, the one who completed you, even when everything else in the universe tried to pull you apart. As the sun set on the horizon, casting a soft glow across the landscape, Velyara and Ethan stood together. There was no grand event, no crowd of onlookers, just the two of them. And in that moment, as they exchanged their vows, spoken softly but with the weight of a lifetime behind them, nothing else mattered. "I take you as my bondmate," Velyara said, her voice steady, her hand resting on his chest. "I give you my heart, my soul, and all of myself." Ethan took her hand, his fingers brushing over hers, and looked into her eyes with an intensity that spoke of everything he felt for her. "I take you too, Velyara," he said. "I offer you everything I am, everything I have. From this moment on, we are bound, body and soul." Their hands clasped together, and in that moment something deep inside them clicked, like a final, perfect piece of a puzzle falling into place. The bond was real, stronger than anything either had ever known, and it was theirs. In the days that followed, They moved through life with a quiet certainty. The war was still out there, still threatening their lives, but now there was something else, something that kept them grounded. Their love had become their anchor, their strength. The quiet nights they spent together became a sanctuary, a place where they could just be themselves, free from the weight of the world. They spoke of their dreams, what they wanted for the future once the war was over. "I think about what we could do after everything," Ethan said one night, his voice low and thoughtful. "I want to build something for us, a home maybe, a place where we can just be without all this chaos." Velyara smiled, her eyes softening. "A home. I think I could like that." Ethan reached for her hand, his thumb brushing against her skin as he smiled. "I've never been more sure of anything in my life. With you, I know I can face anything." They lay together, entwined in each other's arms, their love a quiet force that held them steady through the storm. In each other, they had found something more than love. They had found a partner, a soulmate, someone who would always stand beside them, no matter the odds. And as the future stretched out before them, they knew that no matter what challenges awaited, they would face them together, stronger than ever, their bond unbreakable. In the quiet of the night, with only the stars above them and the sounds of the distant battle fading away, Velyara and Ethan shared a look, a silent promise that spoke volumes. Their love was not about grand gestures or promises to conquer the universe. It was about the small, intimate moments, the understanding, the bond. It was a love that was imperfect but real, and that was enough. "I love you," Ethan whispered, his words barely audible over the soft breeze. Velyara's gaze softened, and she pressed her forehead to his. "I love you too." And as they held each other, the promise of forever settled between them. Whatever came next, they would face it side by side, their hearts intertwined in a bond that no force in the universe could break.